Falcha Accorda Parkan Vanishka. Izmishe Reese Smith, Ambassador Genevik Nastad Antaha. Welcome everybody to Phoenix Park. Boy, there sure are a lot of you tonight. I'd like to welcome you to the latest installment of Creative Minds. This has become our flagship program for our cultural diplomacy. We've hosted poets, directors, astronauts, CEO, Pulitzer Prize winners, Grammy Award winners, and many others. Just last week, we explored, the new dynamics. Okay, Phoenix Park is actually haunted, but usually they don't come out till after midnight, but apparently Lord Cavendish is feeling a little feisty tonight. So we discussed American politics, which luckily enough it didn't get me fired, but it was a very interesting discussion. But we're trying to present new ideas to new audiences to engage the thought leaders in Ireland with our thought leaders and try to have discussions where we can talk about ideas and push things forward. That's really what this program's about, and we continue to push the boundaries on it, and we've had some very interesting discussions. And tonight we're going to do New Horizons in Cybersecurity, and I think it will certainly do just that. So we're kind of thinking maybe a little Black Mirror-ish, with some very interesting topics going forward. And I was just thinking, what would be a great topic for a new Black Mirror episode? Ooh, GDPR. I think that would be a very scary one. I think some of you around here know what I'm talking about. I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel tonight. We are thrilled to have Jeanette Manfra here from the Department of Homeland Security. She's our Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and heads the Office of Cybersecurity and Telecommunications. So she's the Chief Cybersecurity Official in our Department of Homeland Security. So we have been targeting her to come here, and we were thrilled to get her here. And she's been doing meetings with the government, speaking at the Independent Cybersecurity Conference, and then here with you tonight. We're trying to talk about where Ireland is on their cybersecurity and where we are, and explore potential avenues for collaboration. So tonight she's going to be one of our panelists, and we couldn't be thrilled more. So welcome, Jeanette. Linda Doyle is the director of Connect, the Trinity-based Center for Future Networks and Telecommunication. She's also a professor of engineering and the arts at Trinity College Dublin. She has been a pioneer in the study of telecommunications research, development, and innovation. She's a thought leader in the area of network design, implementation, and security, truly an expert in this field. So we also join me in welcoming Linda tonight. Moderating tonight's discussion will be veteran journalist Derval McDonald. She is the group business editor of the Independent News Media, which owns 4 national dailies, 3 Sunday newspapers, 13 weekly regional papers in Ireland. Gosh, is that it? She's a busy lady, so we were very excited that she could come moderate this discussion, and I'm sure you've seen her host and moderate other discussions. She's quite an expert at it. So we're thrilled to have such an impressive journalist and editor here. So welcome, Derval. Thank you.
You should never call a lady a veteran anything.
So just a few more minutes,
yeah,
please.
Sure.
So I've spent the last few days with Jeanette as we've gone around town, and I've been very interested to hear the word collaboration thrown around again and again. In her meeting with Irish officials and representatives of the American and Irish business community, she's highlighted, of course, the challenges we're facing in cybersecurity today. And boy, if you think Black Mirror is scary, you just think about some of the challenges that we are facing and are gonna face in the terms of cybersecurity. More importantly, though, she's highlighted the necessity for close coordination and cooperation between the public and private sectors if we're gonna win this fight. That is the only way to win this, is to do it together. Collaboration is a vital component of cybersecurity strategies. both within and between our two countries. By working together, we can help to ensure the internet remains open, reliable, and secure. I've been pleased to witness this week how our Irish partners are so firmly engaged with this issue. Looking around this room tonight, I'm delighted to see representatives from the private sector, from government, from the Defense Forces, from the Gardaí, here tonight, and academia to be with us here tonight. We can only achieve digital security through close and committed cooperation. And from what I see here tonight, I'm hoping that this can be the foundation of collaboration going forward. But let's make no mistake, cybersecurity threats are one of the most significant threats to global stability. You know, I don't know that the next world war is going to be fought in cyberspace, but I can guarantee one thing, it's going to be hybrid at least. There will, every nation is developing an offensive cybersecurity capacity, and if there is a war, they will be using those capacities to try to undermine other nations. So we need to be vigilant. That is just for sure. So I think the term would be hybrid warfare. It would be something that would be expected in any war going forward. Already targeted cyber attacks on national critical infrastructure, ransomware attacks on companies, and massive breaches of citizen data highlight just a few of the incidents dominating all of the headlines, several of yours, all over the world. The damage from these attacks is truly difficult to measure. As our access to and dependence on innovation in cyberspace continues to grow, we need a continued international collaboration that addresses these threats while balancing individual freedoms, human rights, and economic growth. Of course, tonight's Creative Minds would not be possible without the goodwill of our speakers, moderator, and our hardworking public affairs team at the Embassy, and our partners. I'd like to thank Matheson for collaborating with us on tonight's event. So before we start the program, I'd like to invite Anne-Marie Bowen, she's the head of Matheson's Technology and Innovation Group, to say a few words. Anne-Marie?
Thanks, Rhys. I won't keep you long. On behalf of Matheson, can I just say that we are delighted to partner with the United States Embassy on tonight's Creative Minds session. I suppose as a lawyer, I'm not often accused of being creative, but actually cybersecurity, I think, is one area where we need creativity. And it's not just in terms of the solutions, the technological solutions and the procedural solutions that we come up with, but it's also in terms of, and going back to Rhys's comments, the collaboration that we put in place between industry partners, between government and industry, and indeed between governments. So I think it's absolutely an ideal topic for the Creative Minds session. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion around collaboration. I think, we've 700 US companies here in Ireland. We see that relationship continuing to grow, notwithstanding certain, uncertainty in terms of international policies, industry policies, and notwithstanding things like Brexit. So I think there's great opportunities for Ireland in this space, but it is really down to us keeping those channels of communication open and working towards that collaboration. So I look forward to hearing the discussion this evening and hearing more about the very interesting and creative ways that government is working towards those kinds of solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. We so greatly appreciate our partners from the private sector. So as I'm sure you're looking forward to this conversation, I'd like to invite Assistant Secretary Jeanette Manfra and Professor Linda Doyle to join Derville on stage for tonight's discussion. Let's welcome to the stage.
Okay, good evening. Can everybody hear me? Good. This is really great for me to come back for a second time as a moderator of the Creative Minds series. I was last here about 2.5 years ago discussing video games, and it's absolutely fantastic, and I've been down in the body of the floor several times. When I first took part in it, Creative Minds was kind of one of the best kept secrets in Dublin. at that time, and that is no more. And when I interviewed the former ambassador Kevin O'Malley at the Web Summit, I described it as a salon, and it really is. And if that sounds familiar, it's because the current Chargé Rees Smith stole that line from me at the last one. But in journalism we call that plagiarism, but we're amongst friends. Earlier this week, actually yesterday morning, I spoke as a keynote speaker at a conference in Dublin Castle with the Law Reform Commission, who are putting together their programme for law reform, their 5th programme. And each of the keynote speakers was asked to pose a question or a series of questions to the audience that might inform the future programme of the Law Reform Commission. And my 2 fellow keynote speakers were the Chief Justice, Frank Clark, and the former Minister for Justice and Taoiseach, Michael McDowell. And the Chief Justice kind of bemoaned the lack of infrastructure and IT and tech in the court service that would be needed in the future. The Minister for Justice, former Minister for Justice, Michael McDowell, echoed it and kind of asked about issues like the paperless courts. I asked, what happened if your AI toaster had an affair with your VR Hoover and killed the satellite-controlled pacemaker that broke the toaster's heart? And the Attorney General kept his head down, but I was only half joking. I was only half joking actually when I asked that question, because really what I was trying to say is, well look, how are we planning for the future? Because those questions are already being asked. So with driverless cars, and which are going to become very, very prominent the next number of years, what are we going to do about them? Who sorts out the insurance and the liability for that? What do we do around huge technologies and reproductive technologies? In a scenario, there's this evolutionary biologist who predicted that by 2074, only 30% of women would actually be giving birth to children, because the rest of them would be giving birth to them in artificial wombs. And suddenly that 2074 figure seems actually quite far out, because earlier this year was the 2nd time in which a sheep was successfully bred for a time. So technology is happening really, really fast. And what we're going to do tonight is really, really look to the future, not necessarily to get tied up with, because there's a lot of issues at present. So for that reason, I'm going to go to Linda. When I went on to the Connect website, I looked at it, I was just like, your algorithm, what? And so I just thought that the best person that might be able to describe what she does, and maybe even just talk to us where we are in terms of networks and our dependency on it. Linda, you might kick off.
I suppose, well, coming from a network centre that's always looking for funding, we think networks are at the centre of everything, and they're so important. But I suppose for me anyway, and I think for a lot of people, the world is increasingly dependent on networks. We're a very network society, and we're increasingly using network services. And I think everyone here knows what I mean when I say that. So, when you're banking or when you're, your entertainment, your social interactions are increasingly on a network and part of a network. But, going back to your points about the future, Derval, that's only be more the case in the future. So in the world I come from, people talk about remote surgery, where you kind of over a network might operate on somebody. People talk about replacing a lot of the functions that you're talking about with a clever network that would respond to it. So replacing our politicians by an algorithm that's controlled by a network that gathers the data that helps us make decisions. So while these things to a certain extent I suppose sound far-fetched on one level, I think everyone here would agree that that today in the life that you live, that if networks switched off, you'd be in trouble. You wouldn't be able to get to your bank, you wouldn't be able to contact somebody, you wouldn't be able to say you liked something on Facebook or whatever it was. So we're very, very dependent on kind of the network fabric of the world today.
And some more so than other, because for some people, having access to Wi-Fi is more important to them than sex. This is not Linda or I's opinion.
Yeah.
This is an actual survey.
Yes, yeah. So
just for the record, by the way, this is the future. The future is women. But there was a survey, it last year, and it was almost 2,000 business people in US and Europe, and what did they find?
So basically they preferred Wi-Fi to sex or alcohol and chocolate. So, which I think, has anyone ever here seen, Maslow's hierarchy of needs? So there's one now, and they put Wi-Fi right down in the end underneath kind of basic. And I think it's a real, it is a bit of fun, but on the other hand, I think it just re-emphasises that notion that we're also dependent on networks.
But the context actually of that survey was when they were asked to assess human luxuries and necessities on a daily basis.
Yeah.
What is the most important? I want to stress once again, they are not our opinions. It's just stuff we read on the internet. Jeanette, I might maybe go to you just on just that level of dependency and being connected, and the devices we have, we're so contingent and reliant on them. And it's huge opportunities, but that also means the threat is being broadened. So how are governments or other people who have huge parts of our data and therefore our lives, how are we going to keep them safe in the future?
Let me.
Question for you.
Yeah. So I think, it's always hard being the security person, because you're like the Grim Reaper that's telling everybody why this is all going to fail and we should all just, quit now. But I think, I'm personally a great believer, this is the US government, in the power of this networked world that the United States was a leader in developing, but now is such a global phenomenon. And the ability for it to connect societies, to transform societies, to be able to develop economically. And there's so much power there. It's just been such a truly transformative innovation, both within the United States and with other countries, and just increasingly see its potential in the developing world. And so sort of, I want to come at it from, how do we keep that? How do we keep that sort of fundamental goodness and power of what that has provided to our country and continues to provide to our country and to others, but how do we do it in a way that can be a safe and secure environment? And the original sort of thinkers and founders of the internet, it was a closed system. It was not intended to be deployed in the way that has happened now. And so much of what was built, the underlying protocols, everything about it is built off of the concept of trust and being able to have a very decentralized system. And I think and it's built something that is, globally very resilient, but may not be locally. And what we're really focused on, we talk a lot about the attack surface and how the attack surface, right, is that sort of environment that somebody could get into and disrupt. And we've used that term for years, and it used to be where you would have, you still had your networks, but you had a perimeter. You had equipment, it was on premise, you understood what was there for the most part. And what's happened now over the last few years is just through tremendous innovation and things that you just never would have contemplated that people are using these technologies for, you have an attack surface that is, it's undefined. It's almost unknowable. And so what I think that from our perspective is what we want to start looking at is we're never going to get a handle on every single device that's connected to the internet. But how do we think about the sort of underlying principles to include the protocols that sort of cause a lot of the development of the internet? Are there ways that we can build safety and security into that sort of the fundamental nature of the way that we transfer information? Are there technologies out there that can change the way that we think about being able to protect data and sort of having paradigm shifts in that? And I think the innovation and the technology, a lot of it that has developed this amazing capability can also be used to develop enormous safety and security capability if we think about it. If we think about we need to be invested in a safe and secure internet. And I focus a lot on safety.
And to that point, because interconnectedness, yay, brilliant. Interdependency creates big risks that you cannot sometimes control. And one of the things yesterday when you were speaking at the Dublin Information Sec, what you talked about is how industry is really on the front line. And one of the things that I'm very, very interested in is that previously, when you thought of who has the power in terms of data and your information, you think the state. So we developed a lot of human rights and civil rights legislation to protect ourselves from what the state has. But arguably, a lot of the big technology companies are, have amassing huge power. So as the interdependentness and interconnectedness happens, that kind of power base has shifted. It's been one of those paradigm shifts. So how do industry and businesses, they're essentially collaborators with the government, with governments everywhere, to keep that, to keep the internet as safe as can be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not about just who's owning the data, but it's also who's owning the infrastructure that the data is transiting, and how we're working together to both secure the networks, but also the applications and the data itself. And I think that is also. It forces the government to take a very, I believe we have to take a very different view. It's what we've learned over the years is sort of the traditional way that the government interacts with industry. It's usually either from a contractual perspective or a regulatory perspective, but having this environment where they're equal partners. They're oftentimes producers of information that is valuable to us, as well as consumers of information that we have that they need to protect the networks that are delivering the services that we all depend upon. And so it's challenged us, and I think we've made a lot of progress. I think this is a challenge for a lot of governments. I think it's also a challenge in how governments need to think about the dual missions that we, at least, governments like ours who have a view of, preserving the internet and the free speech and the human rights and all of that, is we have an interest, just like a company, in executing our missions via cyberspace, right? Whether that's commerce, trade, national security, law enforcement. How do we build that capacity to do those while working to create norms around responsible state behavior, and what do those confines look like and those parameters look like? But at the same time, we have an interest, my organization, all we're about is trying to build a more defensible, secure cyberspace. And so how do those two sort of government interests and engaging with society and companies as we all navigate this transition to this sort of digital world, I think those are kind of key questions that governments, ours and others, have to work through.
I do think I would kind of take a slightly different angle on that, and I think that's a very incomplete equation. So when I look at it and I look at the role of the individual and the citizen in that, it kind of completely clashes with that. So when I think of data, I think of it as a currency, and you use that currency to pay for things. So when you use a search engine, you're actually paying for the search engine through revealing your data, even though people think of things as free search engines.
Mark Zuckerberg, if it's free, you're the product.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the essence of it. And I think essentially, I think a lot of people don't still realise that that's what they're paying for. And I think the lack of transparency around the role of the citizen in that. So to me, the equation you talk about is the government and commercial,
I would pay for a data broker.
In there.
I would pay for a data broker at this time. I'd love somebody to come in and do an analysis of everything I have.
Have you seen DataCoo? It was a website that existed, and you could sell your data streams, and part of the mission of the website was to kind of, I suppose, to make it more transparent about your own value. So, as companies and governments monetize your value, it was about trying to get the citizen to understand that. And I have to say, I had a pretty miserable, I think my data stream was worth something like 35 cents or something, really. So that just goes to show how badly I am on social media. But essentially, I think the whole point of that is that people to realise that this is
I think we're
a powerful thing. And we're in this equation, but we're not, in general, as aware of it as we should be.
Sometimes I think we're already living in Black Mirror, and one of the things, if I don't understand something, I tend not to like it. So I don't like algorithms because I don't understand them. And that's what one of your expertise is, Linda. But algorithms are not neutral. Technology is not neutral. If it's not neutral, it's political. So I will probably never, ever get a job in the future if I have to apply online, because the algorithms will be going, no way, no way. But and that kind of, it's when you're removing so much of the human sort of intelligence function. So is that an issue, and especially going into the future, because because humans have had to go back into certain things and say actually no, and if they become self-thinking, they're going to go out of control.
So I do think it's an issue, and I was really interested in what Rhys said earlier when you were talking about cybersecurity and cyber threats. And to me, there's kind of two broad bundles. There's the kind of cyber threats we all understand, from kind of, terrorists or people doing the ransomware who are actually attacking a network. But I also think there is an increasing threat in society, and I hate being the doom and gloom person as well, from the kind of increased, I suppose, artificial intelligence and algorithmic society that we live in. And a lot of the time, this is one of my big bugbears. I'm an engineer, and I work with great engineers and computer scientists, but a lot of the time, people think that technology is neutral. So they think, okay, I'm optimizing optimizing something to make it faster or more efficient in some way, and that's the end of it. But I do think the way I describe it from an engineering point of view, we talk about the objective function. The objective function is always political. So I often give the simple example in smart cities. So if you've smart traffic lights, and it can be really dynamic, and the traffic light can be clever enough to know it's nighttime, so it changes in a different pattern than daytime. And people think, oh, that's fairly benign. Why would that be a threat to society? But that traffic light can operate in a way that, for example, it decides that all traffic needs to go away from the salubrious areas, and we'll just dump it into the poor areas and have the traffic jams there. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is when you look at something like a smart city, there's many different algorithms working, and there's no kind of gatekeeper of algorithms, and there's no understanding of the emergent behavior that can happen. So if you have all these things happening, I think we're in this really interesting space and time where our lives are very much controlled by the algorithm, whether it's in Facebook or whether it's physically in the world around us, and kind of understanding how that can go out of sync. I mean, I think that to a certain extent is as much of a kind of cyber threat than is the more cliche things that we might be.
I mean, isn't that the sort of the issue, right? Is we've been slowly ceding control to things that people don't understand. And I use the term cyberspace because there's just not a useful other term, but it actually drives me crazy. And we've talked about this before with some folks last night. It's actually made up of physical things that are owned by entities, whether those are governments or academic institutions or industry,
non-state actors,
or non-state. And it's like the lack of understanding of the average reasonably intelligent person of what a computer does and how it does it and how the internet works is actually I think a huge problem, because people are just connecting thing after thing, and they're not understanding the risk to their, whether it's to their privacy or to some other threat.
I mean, the person from Matheson, I was just thinking as well, are you familiar with the phrase, the Lawrence Lessig phrase, code is law? So if you build it into the world around you and it de facto becomes how we behave, like you were talking about the internet, then it becomes the law, whether it's an official law or not. And I do think we are allowing these things to happen without questioning them. I was looking at, has anyone here ever heard there was a really interesting Radiolab podcast recently, and they were talking about this amazing software that I'd love to use it on our politicians. So you can it actually learns the voice of the politician, and it can kind of put words into their mouth in their own voice. And it's so sophisticated now that you can also put expressions in. So basically you could have a video footage of your politician saying anything you want them to say with their voice and with their expressions. And what was really interesting about that, they were interviewing the people who designed it, and they were pushing back saying, they were commenting on, remember the guy in the US who believed the fake news about Hillary Clinton and the sex ring in the pizza shop? They were saying, if a person like that believed that from text, what will they believe if they see a politician, acting this out? And she initially said something like, oh, well, we need to educate people, but eventually said, look, I'm just a computer scientist, leave me alone. And that's the worry. I'm just an engineer, but just the worry.
This is something I actually have an issue with. Last month I was at a brilliant, fantastic, kind of scary conference on the future of work in Malaga. And it featured loads of brilliant speakers, including the Millennium Project, people predicting what life's going to be like in 2040, 2050. But one of the most kind of honest, if scary remarks was from this kind of VC investor. I'm going to ask the question about, what about regulation, what about governments? And he answered really quickly and said, oh, listen, we don't think about that. Technology first, all that stuff later. And then he sort of tried to backtrack on it afterwards. But I actually preferred his first honest answer, because it was just, and that is it, because, so the technology is there, you go let it do, you break first and ask for forgiveness later. So Jeanette, how do you get ahead of that curve, or how do you negotiate with that when if it's the tech guys and girls and they're just working on their getting their products or innovations out, and then sometimes someone has to come in and say, no, there's a balance that needs to be struck here.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it is a challenge, and I'm also a big believer in technology, although the longer I'm in security, the less technology I'm willing to have. But I think there's a lot of work that could be done in more secure coding, and sort of is what it's always, let's get stuff out quickly, and there's the first to market, and I know that's an enormous pressure to get that out there and we've seen amazing innovations through that kind of competition and getting things out there. And but I think there has to be some work done around building, community of programmers that have more secure practices. There's more vetting in a lot of that, because a lot of it gets to sort of building and then reuse of frankly
And then
poor code.
it's the misuse. So even
Misuse,
especially even in the med tech area, even neuroscience, things that they're revolutionizing people's minds, and then you think, well, what happens if that technology is used for nefarious purposes, or it goes rogue, or the computers start thinking for themselves and do something, really Black Mirror.
I think that's true, but I think all networks empower and disempower, right? And it may be right that you empower certain people through a network, or right that you disempower that way. But being aware of it, I think, is the first issue, and I think enough people aren't. I mean, one of the reasons that in Connect we work a lot, and one of the things I love about the Creative Minds series is that it just brings people from different disciplines together, and we work a lot with we have a lot of artists and people from the arts humanities as well as computer science and engineers. And I think one of the reasons I love actually working with artists is they always question that. They're kind of trained to bring those questions into the space. And people often think of adding artists in, to colour in a nice picture to make a product look good or something like that. And that's not, I think, the valuable thing at all. It's this kind of fundamental questioning of what's empowering and disempowering, and whether that's what you're aiming for. So I think even before you get to the purposely using it nefariously, did you see, I remember reading a Guardian article about social welfare and Internet of Things. So it was the whole idea that you might have a Fitbit on and you wouldn't be able to get your welfare allowance unless you'd walked enough. I'd be totally not eligible for anything on the basis of taking exercise. But it's this whole thing where there's an enormous excitement that you can use something for a purpose that you didn't design it for, because it's so creative.
But especially,
and then there's this negative thing.
Especially in there, I actually got a Fitbit last week. It's sitting on the mantelpiece because
There's nothing to do with cybersecurity.
well, it could be laziness or just my South Armagh fear of, I don't know if I want all of my information going up there. And actually, and you even saw it, in the States, with, technically, on around the issue of health insurance, technically we're all born with pre-existing conditions. And are they actually, what are they going to do with your data? And that's why I wasn't joking earlier when I was saying I would love a data broker. I'd love someone to kind of go through everything on it. I wanted to ask you both about kind of the predictive nature of all the technology. I don't know if any of you remember this American TV show called Early Edition. May have influenced me to go into journalism. The key difference is, it was kind of sort of set in Chicago, and this guy, the night before, he got the early edition of the Chicago Sun-Times, and then he went out and prevented catastrophes happening. I just wanted to outscoop all my rivals. But it was kind of, just interesting on that. If you're going to be able to read people's minds, if you're going to be able to analyse our behaviours, direct traffic, or do all of those things very intuitively, and I don't even worry about AI on its own, or VR on its own, or everything else. It's when they all converge, and I don't even know what the networks of the future are going to like. But one of the things I think from a civil rights perspective is, and Janetta might maybe go to this, is how are we going to be policed in the future when governments, maybe acting in collaboration or not, depending on whether the companies give away their encryption details. I know there's a lot of collaboration, but there may not be. But given this sheer extent of data, how are we going to be policed, and how is that going to affect our civil rights? Because everything has been built up in a very, very, in a very paperful as opposed to paperless world. So what's that going to look like, and where do you see the clashes in the future? Like, do you think the tide will turn, that there will be a point at which people say, no, that's enough? I actually think we're already beginning to see a bit of a kickback. I don't know if anyone agrees on that, but how are we going to be policed?
I would build on your earlier point about having honest conversations with citizens and publicly, sort of as you do make to this transition as a government, as societies, to having this both the access to data, the desire to protect it, the networked, having a really open conversation with civil society about what that means, because I think there's in the United States, we believe we've built a lot of protections into how we protect the privacy of individuals where we are collecting data for law enforcement or national security purposes. And you know, as you have more computing power, as you have more you know, data available to you, I think it's critical upon the government to ensure that we're continuing to carry those protections through, and that we continue to have that.
How do you harmonise that in a global context when people in Europe culturally might have a very different attitude to privacy than in the US, than in India? So how do you, because this is not just about us in our own countries.
Yeah.
This is a truly globalised issue.
Yeah.
It doesn't have geographical boundaries.
There's no boundaries.
Absolutely, and if we're to, you know, continue to realize the benefit, we want to continue to encourage that. I think.
So what Reese was mentioning earlier
yeah.
about, you know, we want to keep it open, reliable and secure. Is that sort of a contradiction in terms now, just given how fast the technology is going, and is that kind of pendulum going to swing back, or do you think it will level off at some point?
I think it could be if we don't take on some of these hard underlying problems in the way that some of these, you know, networked and, you know, some of the technologies, the protocols, the standards, some of these that either were developed without security in mind or are currently, there's nothing there, and we need to develop something as an international community. So I think it could easily be sort of mutually exclusive things if we don't sort of capture that right now and engage and ensure that we're looking at, is there a way to have these things work together? I believe there is. I believe that we have sort of globally the engineers and the technology specialists, as well as the security folks that can come together to work through it. I believe we have to do it on the international stage. I think, you know, to your question about the future of policing, I'm not a law enforcement officer, and nor are we law enforcement, but, you know, I think that is to
But you're very close to it now.
But I'm very close to it, and I'm very supportive. I very much want them to be able to continue to do their job as we migrate and have this sort of challenging world. And so I just sort of continue to say is we have to have an informed citizenry who understands what is happening, both what's happening to their data, and while, you know, the US and European countries may come to different conclusions about what that is, I do think that there's a lot of areas that we can work together. I know a lot of people think Americans don't care about privacy. That's not true. We have an enormous privacy effort. I, you know, publish every privacy impact assessment that we do. I have privacy officers embedded in all of my programs, as does the FBI, all the programs throughout our government. And so I think while we may have different conclusions about what that actually means, if we come to it honestly with conversations with our citizenry and our government and transparently, and we're open about what we do with information and what we do with data, then I think we can manage that transition successfully while preserving the rule of law and security.
Linda, can I ask you just a question on this, just precise that topic, because we are the European de facto HQ for all of these American companies, and that is one of our unique selling points. The corollary of that is that we could be the epicenter for a lot of these debates, even at a European level. Safe Harbour started here, Privacy Shield, Max Schrems, everything. So do you think that we have enough in place?
Oh, here?
Yeah.
Absolutely not. No. So, but I mean, I think, you know, I think even picking up Jeanette's points, I mean, what I worry about in the whole thing is that, you know, so technology kind of to a certain extent embodies our personality. So if you talk, going back to your question about policing, so there's this notion of predictive policing where you try in advance kind of predict something's going to happen. And that, in a lot of ways, boils down to social profiling of some nature or other. And social profiling boils down to, I suppose, cliches, and possibly prejudices, as well as gathering large amounts of data and making possible good meaning out of it. But what I worry about is that the kind of conversations, so I agree with you that if people can talk and you can kind of understand the things and go, but the conversations we're actually having in the real world at this stage are kind of so polarised and so blunt that if that's actually translated into the technology, you know, and our personalities and our, I suppose, the current debate is played out in the algorithms, that's what I think is worrying. And I think no country in the world, including Ireland, is ready for that. But even just even stepping back from that and going back to the more kind of straightforward ways of kind of disrupting networks and cyber attacks.
We haven't even spoken about what happens when, you know, just when people from Africa, from other parts of the world become so much more digitally empowered. One of the things, I'm going to go to the floor now, but one of the things the Millennium Project looks at is job security, and in the future, if technology does displace jobs or not, but if it reaches a certain level, then it's a real threat for democracy, because there is social disruption. And arguably we saw that with Brexit close to home, and with the election of Donald Trump. Do you worry just about that if technology does displace that, and if people are either unemployed or underemployed, that becomes a risk? I suppose for social cohesion.
Yeah, and from a feminist perspective, I worry about it. I read some stuff that Microsoft produced, and they said, you know, because I suppose worldwide, there's a lot of women do more menial jobs, that if you replace those menial jobs with you know, an automated things, and more women will suffer from that situation first. And I do think there's a lot of really, really tough questions about the automation and continued networking of the world. But having said that, I'll say, you started off saying we didn't want to be you know, doom and gloom. And I actually, the other evening, had to give a talk about the end of the world, and I could feel the audience
As you do.
losing the will to live by the end of it. And I can feel myself in this conversation thinking, yeah, that's terrible.
No, there's so many
to everything you
opportunities.
suggest.
I want to give this now the opportunity for the audience to direct your questions. And I know there's lots of people just in the second room there, so if you want to ask a question, just put your hand up. We have some mics, and you might let us know who you are, where you're from, and who you want to direct your question to, not me, just the panel.
Hi, Carla Nellington. I work with the Irish Times. One thing that you haven't discussed and that I'm interested in a response about is just the major scale grids in the US and the threat from external actors trying to attack the electricity grid, power grids, water. And my understanding about 2 years ago from an ex-FBI agent giving a talk at a security event was, so far the attempts have been pretty useless. I think the only one that worked was at an upstate New York on what they clearly thought was, I think it was Iranian actors who thought it was a big dam that they were jamming, and it was actually just a sluice gate on something quite small. But where do we stand now within the US, I think, and what are you most concerned about, and how interconnected are those grids?
Yeah, I think on the electricity side, we have a long history of thinking about resilience of the electric grid from a physical and weather standpoint. And so there's actually a lot of capacity built in the United States system to be able to, you know, balance the load. Should something become overwhelmed on one side, they can pass it. We have mutual assistance agreements sort of across the country. So, you know, if the East Coast is experiencing a massive event, California can deploy folks over and help them restore. And so there's actually a lot of capacity in thinking about the resilience of the grid. What we've been doing over the last couple of years with the you know, about 50 CEOs of all of the sort of the major and the regional electric companies is looking at, okay, now here, that's what we've done from a kind of a physical kind of all hazards perspective. How do we translate that from a cyber? How could somebody disrupt your ability to deliver electricity from a cyber perspective? It's a lot harder than I think, you know, the average person understands to do that. It is definitely possible. So what we're doing with them is working out, you know, both on the prevention side, how do we ensure that we are, you know, kind of on the government side looking at threats to our electric sector, and then the electric sector has the ability to take that information and do something with it. And then on the response recovery side is trying to build sort of the cyber response plans. How do we bring you know, the ICT community, the electric sector, and sort of, you know, for us, right, energy and comms now are like the two underlying things that have to work for everything else to work. And so we've had a very focused effort with the electric sector, with gas and others, the energy community and the ICT community, to sort of say, how do we think about resilience? resilience. And if something happens that we weren't able to prevent, how do we sort of, what's our plan and our contingency plans so that we can prevent it from becoming worse than right now, where we don't have some of those contingency plans in place that we should.
I saw the way Verizon in the US has a gigantic cave under the earth, and it has all of this ready to roll out. It's really, really impressive, all this ready to deploy pieces of equipment like cellular base stations on wheels and HVAC stuff. It's pretty amazing, and obviously that's actually, I think, motivated by a lot of the storms and things that knock things out, and they're really ready to go from the comm side anyway.
Yeah, what we
Which-
do. So one
It's the centre of everything, as
It
I
is
keep
the
saying.
center of everything. Another part of my organization is we're actually responsible for restoring, working with industry to restore communications after disaster. So I have, 20-some people now still deployed in Texas and Florida and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, working with industry to deploy those capabilities.
That's where you're seeing some of the most amazing innovation.
Tremendous,
around that
and
stage.
tremendous partnership. I don't know if any of our companies are here, but they've developed this really amazing way where then it's basically whoever's able to get equipment in first, they just start handing out equipment to everybody and devices to everybody. They work out the payments later, and they don't have any roaming charges. They sort of have this
they
whole
can turn it
thing
on,
where
yeah.
it's like, I'm going to, take care of this sort of disaster area. And so what we're working with both comms and energy is, again, how do we translate all of that resilience and capability into sort of on the cyber side of it?
I even think we saw that recently with Storm Ophelia. I think the reason why we didn't have the level of fatalities, I know we had 3, which were very regrettable compared to the last major one, was because the communication was so effective and people paid attention to it. I have a question, John, here in this side of the room.
Hi, I'm Mark from a local software company here in Dublin called KineSense. I was very interested hearing about your work, Jeanette, about how the US government is working hard to protect IT networks and to develop greater cybersecurity. But of course, we've all heard, about the other arm of the US government, the NSA, which is seemingly actively trying to undermine cybersecurity and weaponize vulnerabilities. And of course, unfortunately, those vulnerabilities get released onto the internet. And I'm just wondering, do you feel like you are colleagues with those guys in that other department? Or do you feel like you're working against them?
I would argue with their premise that they're trying to actively undermine the networks. They have a mission to protect our national security, and they are, some of the most patriotic, devoted civil servants in our government. And I believe that they take their mission very seriously. And they work very hard, and they have a lot of capability. And what I think is, we have a process within the government where we work very closely with them on coordinated vulnerability disclosures. And as vulnerabilities are identified, ensuring that the owners of those vulnerabilities are aware of it and can develop patches, and that we can publicize those vulnerabilities as appropriate. So I absolutely believe that I'm colleagues with them, and we have, and we try to be very open and honest with everybody that we talk to, that, of course we have a relationship with them, but this is how we protect the information. And frankly, if a company comes to us and says, I don't want you to share this, then I won't. And it's my protections that I'm applying to this information. And if they don't want to have that information passed, but many companies are okay with it as long so you minimize it, of course. And there's certain things that people just don't need access to do network defense. But I absolutely feel that I'm a colleague with my NSA partners.
Okay, there's a question I think over here, just at the back.
Declan Power, Independent Security and Defence Analyst. Continuing the theme of national security, I'd be interested in what your thoughts are on this issue. Not so long ago in this wee island, the Electricity Supply Board was penetrated by an entity that would be considered governmental. Draw from that what you will, without pointing fingers in any directions. And yet, in this jurisdiction, in the 26 counties, we have a cyber security task force we have the Defence Force Directorate of Intelligence, the Garda Crime and Security Branch. There doesn't appear to be, I would argue, the necessary nexus to be able to respond to that. With the cyber people are experts in a technical manner. The military and police colleagues are supposed to be the strategic and intelligence analytical function. Is this something we should be particularly concerned about in this country, given how much we rely on foreign direct investment from your good selves in the United States?
Are you, sorry, Declan Power, my former lecturer, are you arguing that we should have a national oversight body?
I would. I definitely, but I didn't want to put words in anybody's mouth.
No, it's just an interesting debate because even when we come up to policing, should we be separating the policing and intelligence, security intelligence function? It's an issue that sometimes come up in that. So is it, and that is something that when you compare the PSNI to here. So is it that you're arguing for, that a complete kind of oversight body to bring together all of those intelligence functions?
Sure. Derval, I would argue that we should have some sort of an oversight entity that coordinates the intelligence functions of police, military and the cyber security force. And I think until we get our act together there, we are leaving ourselves open. And that penetration of the Electricity Supply Board this summer is a wake-up call to us. Because it's not always that we will be targeted as a nation state, but we have a duty of care to our partner nation states. We're in this world together. The IT world is a joined-up world.
We're a big supply chain.
Yes, and Ireland is part of this joined-up world. And from a practitioner and academic point of view, I'd be interested in what your thoughts are. Sorry, you were going to say?
I was just going to say, I think you make a very good point, because, and I think in one sense it's becoming harder to deal with things because everything's joined up. So I could pick agriculture and I could start to talk about smart agriculture and precision agriculture and a connected community there and weaknesses in that. And if you look at digital policy in general in Ireland, I think it can't, we haven't come out of, even if you look at even if you forget the cybersecurity bit for a minute and you look at digital policy in general, I think we have things in kind of all of these silos that can no longer stay there, because you need to cut across that way in a huge number of things. And how to do it effectively, I'm not quite sure, but I would echo the need to do that. We were discussing earlier, you probably have read, the way there's been increasing threats now where people put things, Internet of Things, where they put dolls on it and they become weak points in the network and people get in, or baby monitors and things like that. And it is becoming increasingly hard to think of any of these things without having a wider bunch of expertise around them. So I think for many reasons this kind of broader oversight is needed, because it's, we have threats in the obvious places and now in the non-obvious places as well because of this connected world.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you from the U.S. experience, I think it's important to have an entity that, like mine, and is actually creating with the National Cybersecurity Center, that is solely focused on network defense. The primary aim is, building that more safe, secure cyberspace and critical infrastructure, and being and working with industry. That's not to say that they're the only ones that do it, but having that organization whose sole mission is that, and having them sufficiently empowered and engaged within the government to be able to, to the gentleman's question, to be able to advocate for the position of the network defenders when the government has to make decisions about what is the sort of steps that we need to take, and so I think that's very important. I think it's we have a body that sort of oversees all intelligence functions within the U.S. to try to coordinate. I think one of my big fears always is that there's a lot of information that is flowing around, and I sometimes become concerned that we'll miss something, and you have so many people looking at different aspects of it, and that's sort of my kind of always the one thing where people ask what keeps you up at night, aside from my son, is just that will we miss something? Are we missing something?
Well, data tells a different story depending on what you're looking for.
And that's where I think having that that organization that is solely focused in looking at those critical services and functions, those, that what is it that we need to protect as a government, as a country, and then having that ability to connect across, because military plays an incredibly important role, law enforcement, intelligence, but then having that sort of civilian one that can kind of sit in the center and be able to sit as a hub, not to tell everybody what to do, but to coordinate all of it and to have sufficient authorities.
Tricky when they've different sensitivities and different
It is not.
priorities.
I mean, it is not an easy. I mean, we have some, knockdown.
Can I have time for one more question? Ideally, I'd love to take it from the back of the room. Is that Fiona Murphy? It is.
I'll stand up as I'm representing the cheap seats down the back here. I'd just love to get your input. I'm 40 years of age, so I fall, I think, generationally in between the age group that didn't grow up in cyberspace, but is, 15 to 18 years used to it, and didn't develop in public in terms of, an imprint of my data all out there. And I now work, I also have a past career in the performing arts, and I now work in communications with Fleischmann Hillard. So we're in the business, obviously, of reputation management, corporate reputation management, etc. And we recognise and value our, clients and our own, I suppose, internet presence and that sort of, it's a valuable thing, but equally it comes with a certain amount of risk. And I suppose I'd love to know, even from a personal perspective, in terms of your imprint online and like down the line to see what will happen, what, if any, importance there is in terms of what there are in terms of movement in cyber security, what you're doing, the importance of personal reputation, personal data, public output from a younger generation, influencers, people who have grown up on Facebook or whatever, down the line, Derval mentioned there in terms of employment, job security and so on. Like, is it valued in terms of what you're doing from a cybersecurity perspective? Is it valued to put some sort of onus on culturally what we can do as people to educate and have the next generation aware of what they're doing and the responsibility that comes with cyberspace?
I value that when I went to college there were no smartphones.
You neither.
That's a really, really interesting question about, and I suppose when you look at, I said earlier, my young niece, her first word after mum and dad was charger. So we have an entire generation that's growing up, kind of the swipe generation, and we give away, we all do, but particularly young children give away so much about their privacy, their identity, probably telling the secrets from the mum and dad, but actually it's very, very hard, I think, sometimes for young kids growing up. There was an accident a couple of years ago, actually, Jeanette, in San Francisco airport, and it was actually raised at a meeting this morning, where within 30 seconds of the crash of an Asiana plane, somebody had taken a tweet and sent it out. But there was an amazing picture of people coming off a burning plane, and the first thing one of the survivors did was take a picture and tweeted it. And here I am, I'm safe. So before he told his mum and dad and everything. So the whole culture of what we're doing is changing. And what can we do to kind of protect kids growing up and also protect our own reputations when, they're probably talking about, Linda talking about Wi-Fi and sex on the internet as we speak.
Probably are.
But what can we do? Like, would you worry as a parent with a 5 3/4-year-old kid?
Yes.
About the world he's grown up in?
Yeah, I think, sort of growing up at that same world. Now, I grew up, my father was a programmer, so it was a little bit, unusual, I think, where, we had computers in the 80s, which was, we were sort of the ultimate nerd house, I guess. I think what's interesting to me, so I always tell the story, my son, when he was 3, he had this truck, the most annoying police truck. Of course, my mom bought it for him, and it made this really obnoxious noise, this police noise all over, and it was so loud. And the batteries died. And he's coming up to me, he's pressing the buttons, and he's like, it's not working, it's not working. And I was like, oh, it's probably the batteries died. And he looks at it, and he flips it over, and he goes, I think it's downloading. And I was like, oh my God. And it's this sort of like, it's this notion, and you talk to, you call them millennials and all that, that I am very cautious of my privacy, and I'm very careful about what I post online, and I'm so glad that there were not smartphones when I was in college, and there wasn't a Facebook when I was in college, because who knows?
In fairness, though, if there's going to be any kid in America who's to be fine, it's going to be your son.
I hope so. but you think about this, and so I don't post pictures of him online because I'm trying to be considerate of him as an individual and what he may want his online presence to be, and a lot of but you talk to this generation now, and the folks in their 20s that kind of grew up with this, and there's just they're like, I don't care, everybody can see it.
But I think most of us made our mistakes offline.
But I don't care. That's what
Well, I like to convince myself.
But now they have to care because
yeah, but I think we're thinking about this the wrong way, because I think essentially we're all developing new forms of identity, and the way it is to me, right? And I'm not a great social media person myself, but I think the person is evolving into I think an analog and digital self, and the way we accept the fact that you might have an implanted, a transplant in a kidney, or you might have a prosthetic because you were missing an arm. I think the digital self, we're looking increasingly and connect at the kind of future digital self where your personality and part of who you are is embodied online, and we're even now looking
that
at
would make
things.
Tinder dating very complicated.
It would make it, yeah. And you have multiple.
When you're analog self.
You have multiple slices of yourself. But now we even look at things like networks within the body, where you use synthetic bacteria to pass messages from one part of your body or the other, inside to outside the body, and the quantified self and things like that. And I think we can kind of look at them. I mean, I think we can look at them and go, oh, I didn't have that when I was young. Or we can look at them and think, okay, start to ask the kind of questions we should ask. What does equality mean in this new world? What does digital equality mean? What does it mean to have identities? I think we're in a world where people are discussing identity in terms of gender a lot, and how many genders are there? I think these kind of questions need to be actually just put into a digital context. And I think if we start to have those questions, and what do human rights mean in a digital context? What does digital self-harm mean? I think if you start to ask questions like that, you rather than say, I want to kind of confine it back to the analog world that I knew, you maybe start to find new ways to behave online, rather than think you have to kind of keep away from it.
There we go. We could, I suspect, continue this conversation for so much longer, but I do have to bring to a close. I just want to thank both Linda and Jeanette for making my job really fun and really enjoyable.
Thank you.
And thanks for your attention. I'll hand you back to Reece.